Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Jessica Smith, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Fletcher School. And I'm very pleased to welcome this afternoon's panel to talk about outreach and whether or not it works. We're all here today trying to figure out how to make an impact with the work we do and how to bridge the gap between the traditional academics and this changing marketplace of ideas. And I can't think of a better panel to help us sift through how we reach out and interact with both the gatekeepers of the media. We have two leading magazines in international affairs. We have Justin Boat from Foreign Affairs magazine, and he's the deputy managing editor. And we have Ben Pocker, who is the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And we are also pleased to welcome Henry Farrell, who can give us the perspective from an academic. He's the associate professor of political science at GW and also a blogger for The Monkey Cage on the Washington Post, and can talk a little bit about bridging that gap directly through content creation. And then finally, we have John Cisternino with the Tobin Project, who can give us a little bit of a perspective on an organization that's taking a bit of a different approach. They're the 2013 MacArthur winner for effective institutions, notably for their work trying to develop a new model of connecting academics and policymakers at the initiation of research. So we wanted to take the opportunity to capitalize on this elegantly constructed agenda and really segue from a lot of the great points that were made earlier today and make this a little more interactive. We'll ask each one of our panelists to spend about 5 to 8 minutes talking about the view from where they sit, and then we'll start taking questions and take it from there. So thank you very much. Without further, Justin.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jessica. I'm neither an academic nor a policymaker. I'm here as an emissary from this strange realm that lies beyond. It's the realm of the dreaded general audience, full of intelligent and curious people who want to learn about the world, and also full of unintelligent, incurious people who want to learn more about Justin Bieber. And of course, if I'm being honest about things, almost everyone who belongs to the first category also belongs to the second category in some way or another. So from my point of view, listening to what has been said earlier this morning, I'm struck by the fact that there's kind of a bit of a tribalism that's going on, where we're having this conversation about policymakers on the one hand and academics and scholars on the other hand. And I think to the foreign affairs readership or to the general mass audience readership, looking at that, the distinction might not seem so clear. They might believe they're essentially looking at one single unitary elite that is essentially talking to itself most of the time. And so I think it's kind of important to keep that in mind. I'm sure most people do have that in mind, but when trying to figure out the exact valences of, well, how should scholars talk to policymakers, and shouldn't policymakers listen to more scholars? Well, okay, from a sort of class point of view, this is a fairly insular world. Now, of course, foreign affairs is hardly exempt from that. We're sort of part of a legacy establishment media. We're an elitist publication in the sense that we believe there are very few genuine authorities out there. We're democratic, though, in the sense that we think there are a great number of people who want authoritative takes, whether they come from policymakers or scholars. But the other point that I just make on this, larger scale thing is that the sense of a moral obligation that Mike Dash was talking about and that Zeynep referred to. I think at Foreign Affairs we'd like to think that scholars and policymakers don't necessarily see this as an obligation at all, but rather as the reason they got into the business in the first place, to enlighten and inform, and that they should want to reach not just policymakers or other scholars, but the dentists and accountants and lawyers and school teachers and who make up our audience and who are a great part of our civil society, and of course the huge global audience that we have and that Foreign Policy and the other publications in our space have. Over half of our readers of our website are actually not in the United States anymore. So again, this debate from that perspective might sound a lot different. what I can say, that might be helpful to people who are trying to figure out the basic question here is that we've heard about relevance and rigor and the sort of tug of war between those two things, trying to balance rigor and relevance. There's a third R that needs to go into that, which is just readability. And as an editor at a publication like Foreign Affairs, I'm here to tell you that the stuff that we get from both policymakers and academics is often not readable. And I mean that in the most literal way. I don't mean that it's not as good as it could be or it just needs a little tightening. It just does not speak to a general audience. Part of that just has to do with the way in which writing is taught. This is sort of an endemic problem in higher education. But part of it is a cultural thing, too. I was explaining to Peter Fever last night that one of the mistakes we see commonly is that there's an attempt to sort of exaggerate the importance of the argument or of the prescription. We were talking about whether to involve policy prescriptions. We get a lot of pieces that are interesting and make an interesting point, but that essentially say, this is the single most important issue in national security, and if we don't fix it, we're screwed. Or, this policy is completely flawed, and unless you understand my argument for it, it will never be fixed. A lot of times what's more helpful is basically explanatory journalism, saying that, if you want to understand X, you have to understand my argument about it. And it's important and interesting, and I'm going to take it for granted that you, as a reader of this publication, know more or less why this is important or interesting. I'm going to tell you again, but I don't have to kind of overinflate or hype the importance of my findings. What I'm going to do is explain for you how to really understand this interesting topic. Obviously, getting rid of the jargon and the arm waving is important too. But the nub of my message to those of you who want to write for a general audience is to keep that in mind as well. The other thing I'll tell you is that there's a fear sometimes, I think, amongst people from the academic community that the topics they're writing about, there's just not enough interest in them. That to be readable, you'd have to be so reductive as to sort of betray, your standards. Don't underestimate the general audience. We had, in the past 2 years, our single most successful issue, as far as newsstand sales goes, was a special issue we did called The Clash of Ideas, which told the history of the struggles of the 20th century between liberalism, communism, and fascism. If we had been Upworthy, we would have said, 3 major ideologies went to war. What happened next will restore your faith in democracy. But we didn't have to sex it up. People bought it, and we didn't really sex it up very much at all. There's a real appetite out there for, and this goes to something that actually Steve Walt mentioned in this really interesting Foreign Policy magazine colloquium on this whole topic. He pointed out that history is often overlooked as a place where academics, even not just historians, but even political scientists and people from other fields, can really do a great public service in explaining the history of the questions that they're asking and the history of the answers that are often given. This is something that I find resonates with general readers more than you might think. So even those of you who are not in the field of history ought to think about the history of your field as a topic that general audiences will appreciate and will get something out of. The last point I'll make, I think, on this in terms of things to think about, how to bridge the gap, how to reach a broader public, is books and book reviews. This is something that we found that has surprised us, that there's a massive public interest in coverage of books. And, you talked about, Dan, the Piketty book, being a bestseller. This is just another data point in that. Important, big books on important topics are things that people want to read about. And a place actually where I've found that people from the academy can really add value is in reviewing important books or even popular books and explaining why anyone should care about these things, why they should read the book, why they should buy the book. It's a way into a topic, it's a peg that isn't necessarily a news peg. It's not, well, how does your, history, your military history relate to what we need to do in Afghanistan? Well, it doesn't, so I'm not going to write that piece. But it does relate to this book that, has just come out on the history of counterinsurgency or guerrilla warfare, and I'm going to tell you what's interesting about this book and why you should know more about this. If you work with an academic press, if your publisher is an academic press, make sure that they know that this audience exists and that you should be pushing to do op-eds, extracts, adaptations from your book. Academics don't push it hard enough, we found with this. There's a big audience for it. Those pieces do really well. And people know the difference. General readers know the difference when they're getting an authoritative take. And they respond by reading with it more, engaging with it more. So a couple of things to keep in mind when trying to figure out this whole issue of trying to bridge a gap.
Thank you. Ben?
I'm so glad that Dan Dresner asked me to be here. And I'd like to say that it's good to see so many familiar faces. But literally, as I walked onto the bus from the hotel to dinner last night, I was excited to see Peter Fever, and who, even after I shook his hand, just smiled at me blankly, like, who are you? And Peter,
I only understand you when you're something nasty.
Right, so Peter co-edits Foreign Policy's Shadow Government blog, and we email, I'd say 3-4 times a week. So I think I can somewhat, in a way, answer the question of this panel. Do outreach efforts work? Clearly, I think we can do better. And clearly, I spend too much time behind my desk. So to revise an earlier comment, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Dan. And it's nice to see so many familiar bylines and email addresses. So I think I wanted to take a little bit from what Justin said and sort of give you a window into what life is like. A little bit about foreign policy, how we try and reach out to the academic community, what's important to us, and how we balance sort of what we produce on a daily basis. If you guys are in the ivory tower, sometimes it feels like we're holed up in a keep on the other side of the Seven Kingdoms. I mean, the gap is there, and it's real, but it's not just confined to academics. I mean, it's for freelancers and stringers who are writing to us from Cairo or Azerbaijan. It's policymakers and practitioners, it's think tanks, it's government officials, it's public relations firms, and people who just like to hear the sound of their own voice. And they want the opportunity, it's fair, and they want the opportunity to publish an FP, and we have to balance all of that. On a daily basis, we receive about 100 pitches and submissions, and that's just to our general editors at foreignpolicy.com email address. That doesn't even balance the ones that come into different editors from friends and colleagues and other places. But the vast majority of the pieces that we publish are actual commissions. We're really the effort is really to go out and find the experts, the people who are smartest and the best writers on certain topics. And that's what good editors should be doing, and I think we try to do that. We're not reaching out to the Flax in DC or to USAID or government agencies who want to promote their own policies. That's not interesting to us, but we get a lot of that, and I think that's important to keep in mind. It's always odd to me that we're seen as gatekeepers. I've never felt comfortable with that term. As you can probably see from my bio, which I clearly need to revise, I try to do serious stuff, but I don't take myself too seriously. And I think that that's also part of that is sort of part of foreign policy as well. But the academy isn't quite as good at that balance. That said, on any given day, even just here in this room, Dean Servitas writes a column for FP. Dan blogged for us for many years. We're working with Mike Turney and the TRIP team on the SNAP polls. Aaron Simpson has written for us, and Jim Goldgeier and Ian Johnstone were part of this panel that Justin mentioned, this conversation on does the academy matter. So we are really invested in ideas, and we are reaching out. But I think there is a fundamental disconnect between the media and the academy, and what the academy thinks should be the outcome of an article, and what we see as our goal in producing and running a daily magazine. A lot of this conference so far has been on the impact, or on what academics and their impact on making an impact on policy. And obviously one of the ways to do that is publishing, whether it's in Foreign Affairs, or the Washington Post, or in Foreign Policy. And I think a lot of people have some, impressions of, I say most of the people in this room probably have an impression of foreign policy. I hope that most people here read us. And And I'm not sure right now, speaking very candidly, if it's all entirely positive. You know, it's not serious enough, you don't like the redesign, you don't like the paywall. We get that. But you know, we are at heart, we're a for-profit company. And we want to make money, and we have to make money. We want to pay our authors and pay them well. We want to commission really ambitious pieces and send people to the far corners of the earth to do the kind of journalism that costs money and that people can't do. You know, we've got editors to pay, and we want to have their lives be good and make sure they're rewarded in their jobs and stay working with us. And you know, we've added a lot of in-house, you know, Foreign Policy isn't the magazine it used to be, certainly not 40 years ago. And it's not the magazine it used to be 10 years ago and maybe even 5 years ago. We've added an enormous amount of in-house reporters, going from, I think, 1 to 8, and we're hiring more. You know, when I came to Foreign Policy almost 4 years ago, I think we had an editorial staff of around 12. It's now 30. We have added a host of new columnists and contributors, trying to, you know, achieve a better thematic and global and gender balance over the past several months, and I'm very proud of those efforts. They're not easy, but we do a lot of different things. You know, we're not interested in just doing New Yorker-style long form, or covering breaking news, or being an explanatory journalism website, or being an academic journal, or being a snarky blog. What we're trying to do is be a little bit of all of those things, and do it the best we can with the resources we have. And that's not easy, and we don't succeed all the time. Sometimes we have a day when it's a lot of snarky pieces and not much deep thought. Sometimes it's a lot of deep thought and not much snark, or we don't have that long dispatch from Azerbaijan or from Mexico. But it's a balance. But I think there is a sense that ideas have been somewhat neglected, and that is somehow being denigrated in the larger mix of the stories we publish. And I want to assure you that that is entirely not the case. You know, but we have an audience that wants all the things that I just said, and they want them now. So we have to think about, you know, we have to think about what is successful, both in, you know, the pieces that people remember, that will drive policy, that influence policy. That's important to us. You know, we want those great pieces of journalism that can win awards, that people remember, like, you know, we all remember the great New Yorker stories. You know, you take around, you read on the train, you tell your friends about. We want to do that, and we have been. You know, we also have to be responsive to the news and events of the day, and we publish probably 25 pieces of content every day, and our readership expects us to do that on a constant basis. But, you know, ideas are important to us. To echo what Justin said again, writing is really important. You know, the ability to translate ideas to an educated general audience, to be quick in writing, to be fast in turning around edits, and to be brave. I mean, you can't be afraid to throw a few punches. These things really matter to editors. But, you know, we're in this new media landscape right now. You know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there were massive layoffs at, you know, publications across the board. Everyone was decrying the death of print, and sort of trying to figure out what media was going to look like. Now there's this sort of renaissance, and it's like a renaissance of ideas-driven, data-driven journalism. You've got 538, The Upshot at the Times, there's Vox, and that's growing. And publications are hiring across the board and building their staffs. And it's a scary and exciting time to be in this industry. You know, whether or not all these publications will succeed, I think, is an open question. I think it's too early to say. But it's clear, at least to me, that they will be successful if they are translating your research, your ideas, the Academy's ideas for a general audience in a way that makes sense, that's sharp and smart. And that should piss you off. This is your turf. And the publications that we see that are being successful, that are bringing new eyeballs, are the ones that are capturing the ideas that you provide and then just translating them. And I think that's a lot of what Justin and I look for, both from the academy and from other people. The ability to bring smart ideas to a publication in a way that is easy to edit, is easy to process, that makes sense. You know, I do think that there is a temperament issue between journalism and the academy. You know, I don't have a journalism degree or an IR degree. There's no one on our staff, I believe, that has a PhD, though some will eventually go on and leave journalism to go do that. And we look for those kind of people. But, you know, we are always reviewing abstracts from, you know, poli-sci and social science journals for our ideas section. We're fans of The Monkey Cage, you know, Duck and Minerva, Political Violence at a Glance. We read this kind of stuff, so we are trying to engage as much in these arguments. You know, and I think there is a little bit of a divergence between our goals and your goals. I mean, as I said, we are trying to run a magazine on a daily basis and make money and be successful and give our readers what they want. But you know, we need to you know, we need to do all those things and do them all successfully, and it is a juggling act. You know, it is thrilling to me when I see that articles get wide range on Facebook, and when they are, you know, when they blow up on Twitter and they engage a conversation. And I love also when I hear from, you know, people within the administration that an article we've just published is making the rounds on the 7th floor of the State Department, or that it has real effect in the White House. That's a really exciting, I feel so lucky to be doing my job when you know, we know that we're making, that something that we've published is making waves. But you know, we also want to have stories that do exceptionally well on Facebook and reach a wide audience, because we're bringing people into this pool, right? We're reaching out, bringing more people in. So, you know, I guess when it comes to outreach, just to summarize, well, you know, we really do try to do this. We get bombarded with pitches and bombarded with ideas from a lot of people, but the academy does not do a good job of this. Just quickly, here are the 3 ways that I get pitched by academics. 1, someone says, I've written a newsy piece on Ukrainian nationalism and ethnic identity in the country's eastern regions. It's 20,000 words. And second, Dear Benjamin, I'm writing you on behalf of Professor blah, 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 who asks if you're interested in a piece on Ukrainian nationalism and ethnic identity in the country's eastern regions. Please contact me at the University Public Relations Department if this is of interest. And the worst is, and I get this a lot, you'd be surprised, we get this a lot. It's, you know, Professor blah, blah, blah is an expert on Ukrainian nationalism and, you know, the country's eastern regions. He's an experienced commentator and would love to, you know, give you a quote.
He's available.
He's available, just call the university's public relations department. Look, when we do outreach, we send emails. You know, we get on the phone and we call professors and experts. We Google them. You can do the same. You know, we're not that scary. We just move quickly. Like, we are fast and we juggle a lot of stuff, as do you do, but you know, we try to keep our door open. We review all the pitches and all the submissions that come in. Nothing gets tossed away. We look at all of them. We have meetings to discuss. So, you know, if you want to help us do our outreach better, make sure your university bio pages have contact information. When we email you, answer quickly or pick up your cell phone.
Okay, well, I'd like to start by going back to the incident that Dan mentioned at the very beginning of today, which was the infamous Nick Kristof op-ed piece on how political science sucks. And those of you who remember that controversy, and it wasn't that long ago, may remember that there was an instantaneous and nearly unanimous roar of outrage from the social science, political science Twitter sphere, telling Nick Kristof he wasn't looking at the right places, he wasn't looking at the right people. And one of the things that kept on coming up again and again and again was this blog, The Monkey Cage, to the point that economist Justin Wolfers complained, so basically saying, well, what the hell does political science have besides The Monkey Cage? I would like to know. As it happens, political science has quite a lot of other blogs besides The Monkey Cage, but nonetheless, the monkey cage, I think, because it had recently been entered into this deal with the Washington Post, it was the most instantly visible sign of a new alignment between media and political science, where political science could actually have a real outreach function. Now, obviously, I'm a contributor to the monkey cage, and we all found this kind of flattering. But what I'm here to say today is that I think the monkey cage model may not be sustainable over the longer term, and certainly is not generalizable. There are a lot of problems. We are able to do stuff. We are able to maintain some real and genuine outreach, but I don't think that we can serve as a kind of universalizable model for how political scientists ought to do this kind of stuff. First, what can we do? What has been good? And I think that the Washington Post, moving to the Washington Post, has helped immeasurably in a variety of ways. It's given us a lot of reach and kudos that we otherwise would not be able to have. And that's something which is quite important when political science as a discipline is struggling politically with various people who would like to defund the NSF because they think that political scientists have absolutely nothing useful to say about politics. We get lots of readers. Last month we had, I think, 1.6 million page views. This month we will have substantially more than that, thanks to a random viral post on trying to get Americans to locate Ukraine on a map, which went crazy, went on to Colbert and a whole variety of other places. I don't think we can sustain that on a monthly basis, but nonetheless we attract a lot more eyeballs than do the average political science journals for obvious reasons. Lots and lots of people want to write for us. Now that we are at the Washington Post, again, it provides a certain kind of kudos. Even if we are a blog, people are able to proudly put on their websites that they have done this for the Washington Post. They're able to put this in their end-of-year reports for their deans, and this kind of stuff counts. So this is all good. The downside is that it is not sustainable as an economic model. We do not do this as a profit-maximizing enterprise. If we did, we would be subject to many of the constraints that Benjamin mentions here, and we would be running a rather different site. We would be looking to maximize the number of posts that did go viral. Rather than trying to present political science findings, we would be straying from what I think is our core mission. But because we don't want to stray from our core mission, we are not able to do this at a level where any of us will be able to make any sort of substantial income from so doing. We do get some money from it, but it's a pleasant, mild bonus rather than anything that could at all provide a sustainable living for any of us were we to strike out and go solo. It's also hard to maintain as an academic model because people don't know how to categorize it. Clearly, people like the fact that we're doing this. We get people coming up and saying nice things to us at conferences about the service that we are doing to the discipline, but the service that we are doing to the discipline is not really measurable. It's not the kind of stuff that people tend to think about. It doesn't fit neatly into the boxes that we have for measuring service, for measuring research, for measuring whatever. It doesn't have the same kind of status that editing a standard academic journal does. So people have a vague sense that we're doing something good. They don't have any specific sense that this is something which is a typically standard, rewarding, disciplinary activity. The only reason that this can be done at all is because if you're a political scientist who is tenured at a not good institution, and here we are extremely and unusually lucky, and I want to stress that, you have some freedom to do stuff around the edges which your deans, which doesn't necessarily fit into the boxes. You have a certain degree of autonomy, and you can do stuff like this, some sort of carving out little spaces in your day to do it. But as this becomes increasingly professionalized, it also becomes a lot harder to do. I was having a conversation with Justin over lunch. Justin has had the unfortunate experience of having to edit some of my prose for Foreign Affairs, and he was enjoying the fact that I was now having to edit the miserable prose of many other academics, a certain kind of schadenfreude or just reversal or whatever. And so we get a lot of submissions from very smart people, many of whom have no idea how to write for a broad audience. And so we have to edit these to make them palatable for a broader audience. And this is stuff we're not doing for any significant financial reward. And so at a certain point, when stuff stops being fun, when stuff is not recognized as being a part of your daily job, you begin to wonder whether or not this is something that you want to do over the longer term. And so I think that there's a certain point past which this does become something which is extremely difficult to sustain. And so we've done a lot of very good stuff. For example, Josh Tucker, my colleague, has done extraordinary work over the last several weeks, marshalling together people to contribute on Ukraine. This has gotten, I think, a lot of positive publicity and a lot of readership. But it's the kind of thing which cannot be sustained over a longer period. There's no model for making it sustainable over a longer period. We do have some support. For example, Carnegie supports Mark Lynch's efforts to try and create outreach through for various academics involved in the Middle East. It could be that foundations are interested in doing this kind of stuff, but also foundations very often have their own specific hurdles that they have to jump in terms of justifying what they're doing, which doesn't necessarily all of the time fit with the kind of activities that a broad interest political science blog wants to be promoting in terms of promoting public debate and getting academic information out there into the public argument. Now, all of these are real problems. They're also high quality problems. We are, in many ways, I think, as close to the best case scenario as you can imagine. There are a lot of people out there who are not in this best case situation. In particular, there's a kind of a flowering that is happening at the moment of broader intellectual debate across a variety of new websites, new magazines, new publications, which is being fueled more or less by graduate students and by adjuncts who are doing this stuff without any sustainable economic model. They're doing this for pittance, or they're doing this for no pay whatsoever. Again, this is something which I think cannot be sustained over the longer term. This is something that Sarah has written a lot about extremely eloquently. And there is something that is wonderful, something that is important, something that deserves to be sustained, but something where there is no underlying economic model that makes it sustainable, and no underlying model within the academy that provides for this work being recognized as the kind of stuff that you ought to be doing if you are being a productive and busy and valuable scholar. So this is a gloomy assessment. I don't think that it's all gloom. I think that there are ways in which you can do smaller stuff around the edges. But I do think that if we want to try and build this out, we need to really think about the underlying economic fundamentals of what we are doing. Other point, which is somewhat tangential, but again goes back to Nick Kristof and goes back to some of the conversations of this morning, is who we should be doing this for. And Nick Kristof, very clearly in his arguments that political scientists were not public intellectuals, he had a very clear image of who a public intellectual is. Mac Bundy. As my colleague Sam Goldman remarks, so for Kristof, public intellectual is a Mandarin, somebody who, quote, moves easily between Harvard Yard and Washington, usually without encountering many members of the public along the way. And this is pretty pungent, but I think is absolutely on target. And it also, I think, mirrors a broader set of complaints about the lack of contact between academia and the public policy making establishment, which is much of what drives the argument within international relations. And so there is something, so this can be easily caricatured, there is something real that is there, but there also is a broader public mission, a kind of John Dewey kind of mission of trying to engage, inform an intelligent public, which is what Justin was talking about earlier, which is equally and perhaps far more important, and something which we really do not engage with in international relations as part of our core mission, and which we really ought to. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. Thank you, Dan. I guess my short answer to the questions of the day are yes, that academia is needed and outreach can help. I think we can do better, though. And I want to say agnostic on the Kristof question of whether there's been a golden age when we did better. But I think that we can do better, and my organization is sort of committed to trying to help scholars to do better in getting good work to matter in the world. And I thought I might just say a little bit about our experience that way. So my organization is called the Tobin Project, and though we're based in Harvard Square, we're named after a Yale economist, James Tobin, who was a Nobel laureate. And we're named after him because our founder, David Moss, had an experience of Tobin as a teacher in graduate school in the 1980s, when Tobin railed against what he saw as a huge culture change in his own discipline of economics, where when Tobin had been a graduate student and a young scholar in the 40s in the wake of the Depression, he felt and he thought that everyone he was walking next to felt that there was a public responsibility that they were all weightily carrying on their shoulders to be figuring out how to keep another depression from happening, to understand the economic world in such a way that they could be solving a really important public problem. And Tobin's sense was that by the time the 1980s had rolled around, that the discipline had changed radically in its cultural norms, such that to be overly concerned with a public problem was a sign of intellectual weakness. And so his smartest students, the ones who could keep up with him mathematically, were sort of dissuaded from being too cognizant of public issues that you might actually be trying to solve and do better with, because that was a distraction from what was rewarded, from what was deemed respectable. And I have no doubt that we've made some steps in a positive direction since then culturally. But I also think that we have further to go, and for all of the wonderful stories of people who haven't felt that anybody's tried to dissuade them from pursuing the most important questions in their own research here, I've heard a number of ones elsewhere where people have faced significant obstacles from dissertation advisors, from peer reviewers at journals. And so when we started the Tobin Project, when they started the Tobin Project, I wasn't there at the very beginning, it was very self-consciously an effort that was just of tenured faculty, precisely because they didn't want to be creating a suicide mission for junior faculty members. But the good news, I think, is that it's possible to create a culture change in academic disciplines by changing the hearts and minds of the people who constitute those disciplines. Because to a greater extent than most places in the world, the disciplines are sort of, the norms are self-enforcing. You decide what your discipline is going to care about. So my organization was built to try to change academia to better live up to Jim Tobin's feeling about what it ought to be doing. And a lot of how we try to do that and how we've tried to do it over time is outreach. But outreach may be at a different part of the process than one is used to thinking about. So in order to choose an important topic that is drawn from the world, a puzzle out in the world that needs solving, one has to be looking at the world. And it's easy in academia, as a graduate student, for example, but by no means only, to only be talking to other people in your discipline, to be getting your problems from the journals, and to through no sort of desire to be avoiding important problems, just to be bathing in a certain kind of intellectual climate where the problems that loom large are the problems of the literature. And sometimes those are the most important problems, but often they're not. Right? Questions come up in the literature, and it's a further question whether answering that question is actually going to help people in the world to do something different. And I don't mean to suggest that all people should do is try to go the last mile and do applied research that'll help someone tomorrow to build a better peace treaty or a better gun or what have you, but rather that when you're looking broadly at the world and you see that our understanding is outrun by events, there are questions that come up, and they're often deep, hard questions that require long, hard work over the course of 2 years, 5 years, 10 years to be trying to grapple with and come up with understandings that are actually moving the ball in the sense of helping people out in the world to do better at making peace, at making prosperity, at there's no end to important problems in the world. So what the Tobin Project initially did was bring together scholars and policymakers and other sorts of important stakeholders in the world to try to help scholars to see what was on the plates of people outside of academia, and to try to get them to sort of take up those questions. And at first we just convened these groups and sort of expected that the magic would happen. And by and large, it didn't. What we found was that we created conditions where people who hadn't really been trained or hadn't been sorted to have a skill set in being pundits were trying really hard to be pundits and to tell people what they already thought ought to be the case. And so you had a lot of academics talking to policymakers about, well, here's what you should do, and policymakers not particularly thinking that that was great advice. And so a trick was to try to devise conversations where the scholarly outreach wasn't just happening in a kind of, I as scholar know something and I'm trying to convey it to you now direction, but that it's more circular. And so we tried to create situations where scholars were listening to policymakers and listening often in a critical way. Occasionally you'd get a question that was a very good question that was worth researching and that a scholar could contribute a lot to. So we have a volume that's just coming out on preventing regulatory capture that is sort of that way, to simplify only a little bit. But often you'd get questions that you as a scholar are not particularly well suited to answer, right? Questions about, well, how should I mark up this bill that I need to vote on in the next 2 weeks? Or, what should we be doing about this situation in Libya where, maybe even if you're a Libya expert, you have no idea what's actually happening on the ground for the time frame that the advice is needed. But at the very least, in talking to people out in the world, policymakers among them, but by no means the only ones, you get a sense for what the conventional wisdom is. You get a sense for what people are considering problems and what people are considering solved, and then you can go back to what the understanding of the world is and see where there's slippages, where either people are running with the conventional wisdom that we can do better than, or people are just confused, or people see a problem and they don't have a solution, but if they had a solution, things would change. And so what I'm mostly here to encourage you to do is to be considering outreach extremely broadly, because as people talked about a lot in the last panel, you occupy as a scholar a very, very special, privileged place in society, which is not to say there aren't pressures, but that in being a scholar, especially at an elite institution, where once you have tenure, you get to study the questions that you want to study. You have an important responsibility to the public. There's a reason why we have tenure and intellectual freedom. And it's not something where you should be doing what anybody else is telling you to do, but it's something where you should be trying hard to take on the questions that you think are most important, the ones where you think you can make the biggest difference, and not just the ones where you can generate the most publications. And you, I think, have a responsibility to be trying to uphold a certain sort of norm within your discipline and beyond your disciplines, of tackling big problems, of rewarding the people who are trying to solve important problems, and being willing to look beyond the walls of your particular discipline or your particular methodology in finding people whose methods are complementary to your own and trying to help solve these problems. So maybe that's enough to say at first. Thank you.
Thank you. If I might ask the first question, I actually wanted to follow up on one of the topics raised this morning. And if we're trying all to figure out how to bridge the gap, there's been a lot of discussion over whether it's an issue of access, that is better writing, better communication, better ability to tap into this new market, or is it one of relevance? Is the research coming out of academia policy relevant? Is it relevant to the public? Can I ask each of you to comment? So for Justin and Ben, how much of what you're being pitched on a daily basis, like it or not, you are a gatekeeper and you are making judgment calls about what's relevant. How much would you say is the former, one of access or not being able to communicate or reach out or articulate, and how much is one of relevance?
A lot of the stuff that comes into foreign affairs that's unsolicited or that's sort of vaguely unsolicited, there's been some contact between some member of the staff and a writer or a policymaker or a scholar, is either interesting but not important, or important but not interesting. And it has to be both. In order to reach a general audience, it really needs to be both. Now, almost everything that is interesting, probably, if you think about it the right way, you can figure out why it is also important, and vice versa. But usually people aren't thinking about it, they're only thinking on one or the other vector, not both. You could come up with all different kinds of synonyms for that, interesting and important, I'm sure, relevant, But I think I couldn't come up with a percentage breakdown. But most of the things I see, I'm not saying to myself, what the hell is this person thinking? Why are they sending it to me? It's clear to me that, okay, this is, sure, okay, this is a topic that we know is relevant. We know that people are thinking about this. We know that it would be better if people understood this more. The problem is that the argument that we're getting is frequently either not clear or not relevant. The topic, it's easy to pick a topic that's policy relevant. What's really hard to do is to make a clear, original argument about that topic that's going to add value to public discourse.
Yeah, I don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. To echo what Justin said, I can't even find a number to say how many Ukraine op-eds I've received in the past 3 months, and we've published a lot of them, but the bar gets higher and higher and higher and higher. And we set it even higher than that because we already have a bunch of people like Peter Fever and others who are already writing for us on a regular basis who we trust to bring us smart takes on those subjects. I think there is a lot of policy relevant research and scholarship out there. It often doesn't come to us. And I don't think it's going to other publications, but it's certainly not coming to us that, I have crunched the numbers on the demographics I'm going back to Ukraine again, but crunched the numbers on the demographics of Eastern Ukraine, and I've looked at 3 different polling results, and there's something that's really interesting here, and let me tell you why that's significant. I think publications of this sort, we get a lot of op-eds, we get a lot of people who want to tell us what they think, but we don't get, I think there is a lot of relevance in the scholarship, in the academic community, but that stuff doesn't come to us. We're not on the receiving end. And whether that's a sense of shyness or an inability to communicate or just a fear of, I don't know these editors, I haven't had lunch with them, we live in different cities, it's not coming to us.
If I can follow up both with you and with Henry, as you look at the different media, as you look at the commission pieces versus the snarky blogs, or do you find that some is one home has a more natural home for some types of work and others are a more natural home for other? And along with that, are they different audiences or do you see them as one and the same?
Okay, well, I guess the way that we try to do things is we look for people who are academics, obviously, and we look for academics who have a single interesting point that they have to make. So we get a lot of unsolicited pieces which are bad op-eds. Academics are not even bad op-eds, maybe good op-eds, but we are not in the business of publishing op-eds. We're in the business of publishing something where somebody has something interesting or unusual to say. It could be a piece of data, it could be a graph, it could be an unusual point about the ways in which Ukraine is structured federally, that has unknown are relatively unknown implications for how politics is going to play out. We're looking for people who can present simply and cleanly a single interesting piece of information from their academic scholarly knowledge, which would otherwise be unknown. So I think it's somewhat different thing than an op-ed, and also somewhat different than foreign policy or foreign affairs, where you want to provide something which is more holistic. What we try to do is we try to provide a kind of a mosaic over time, reflecting the fact that there are very different scholars out there with very different understandings, very different takes, but each of whom may have something interesting or valuable to contribute. And so to build upon what Benjamin was saying, there are a lot of people out there, and one of the value addeds that we have is that because we are members of the scholarly community, we sometimes know where the gold is buried. Mm-hmm. And we not only know where the gold is buried, but we're able to go to somebody and say, you've got a really interesting piece which has this point. Write something for us developing this point. And here again, if you look at what Josh Tucker did with Ukraine, where I think we had 30 or 40 odd blog posts from different people who are experts in the field, that took a really deep understanding of the field, who was working in it, and what specific value added each of these people might have in order to solicit this, in order to bring this out.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. Ben?
question is to Ben and Justin in particular, which is to say, I don't deny anything your characterization of a lot of academics who submit stuff, the problems you mentioned in terms of being able to write, passably and being bombarded with university PR departments, all noted. I guess my question, though, is to what extent is this unique for academics? Because, first of all, I know some people who aren't academics who also can't write their way out of paperback. And because I was a blogger at Foreign Policy for a long time, I was on the receiving end of a lot of publicity emails, and most of them were not coming from university PR departments. They were just coming from, people who had a book coming out or something, and so I get, this is not to defend academics. I want to know how unique the problem is to the academy as opposed to more generally. And in some ways, what ways can academics make themselves a little more distinctive and therefore, pique your interest more, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Yeah, I guess my gut response is that the thing that's distinct about it in academia is the tragic quality of it, right? Because the gap between what the academics have to offer and what they are able to express is quite large, whereas your typical hack, it's just, well, he can't write and he doesn't have any good ideas. Okay, so fine. That's the distinction I would say. But no, more seriously, I mean, obviously bad writing is endemic to our society. And if you look at the position papers or white papers that come out of non-scholarly think tanks or the Hill or any other source of information, there's a lot of bad writing. It's true. And we should say, and I'm sure Ben would agree here, that's our job. I mean, we can complain about it, but it's my job to make the writing better. And I don't somehow think like, oh God, I'm gonna have to actually do some work today. That's why I'm an editor. I like doing that. So yeah, it's not unique to academia, but I do mean it, that it's frequently very frustrating to see, this is a great idea, this is a great argument, but wow, I'm just not sure we're gonna be able to carry this thing over to the finish line because the distance is really far.
Yeah, what he said.
So this is an interesting question for you all from sort of the being your job to read writing, good or bad. But we also have a room full of educational professionals. I'm told you all teach as well as research and blog and do these things as well. How do we fix the broader writing problem, right? The problem I think maybe that Dan's getting to is not that academics can't write. No one's being taught how to write well anymore. I mean, like really close to no one. The Marines that I used to teach really struggled with basic writing, and they were going to go on to long careers, in the military. The staff that I hire now, we work really, really hard to break the terrible habits that they got at whatever wonderfully expensive university they went to or whatever. Are there ideas for some ways of generating better writing or tricks of the trade that might get us all out of this particular dungeon that we've locked ourselves in?
I think to some extent it is just a gift. That said, we hire a number of people who come out of the top journalism schools, and yet we still need to train these people and refine their ability to edit and to write clean and effective prose, to fact check, to make sure that their arguments are sound, to actually get on the phone and call people to source their information correctly. It is. I think we view almost all of the hires we make at sort of the, from the entry level up to the mid level as apprenticeships of a sort. And I certainly know that's how I learned how to do my job. I mean, I came to a publication that Justin and I were actually ran the same publication at different times. And I came on, basically as a sort of copy boy. I was hired because I knew an antiquated word processing system. But over the years there, I engaged in the copy and I learned the arguments, and I, found writers, and I spent time. It is a craft. It's not rocket science. I mean, what you guys do is significantly more difficult and more impressive. But I don't know if there's a magical solution. I have not seen. I don't think the journalism school is. They teach form there. They teach some really good habits. You need. These are the the checklist of responsible journalism. This is how you file. This is how you work a beat on a subject that you're not interested in. Go cover this. That's really important. That's like taking, coursework, right? in a master's degree for a PhD, you have to do some of the work. But there's no silver bullet for that. I mean, I think it's a craft that's learned.
John, I'd be interested if the Tobin Project has a take on that, given that you work collectively with multiple academics and policymakers. Do you have in-house writers, or how does the writing process work and submission process, or do you not take it to that point?
So in general, we're working with scholars directly. So we work with scholars to identify important questions, and then the scholars who are involved are working on answering those questions, often in constellations that they wouldn't find in their own departments. So we work with the scholars, we read stuff, we give advice, but we're certainly not teaching scholars how to write. I think, if everyone's put their time in on the front end and we're clear on what the questions are that we're trying to interrogate, I think, by and large, really good people working in good places are able to carry through an argument quite well. In terms of then turning that into something that's punchy prose for a lay audience, we do a little bit of playing a kind of coordinating function in trying to help scholars to connect with people in the policy world and the media world who might be interested in their work. But I think, to me, the big thing is the question. Right? It's hard to translate when your work is on one question and you're trying to then opine on a different question in the real world. But when when your work is sort of lined up with understanding things in a kind of practical way, albeit maybe a very theory-rich and practical way, cutting to the chase, I think, is much easier.
I want to just sort of jump in on what Josh said now and before. I mean, part of this is a chicken and egg problem. If the people in this room wanted to be pundits, you would be pundits, right? You're academics. You care deeply about a specific field. You like the inquiry that comes with it, and there is a certain, solitary. It's sort of at some level, you've got a group of peers, but it is a solitary exercise, the amount of research. I can say this for us, we love that stuff, right? We want people who geek out about their certain subjects. When we interview people, we always ask them about the arcane things that they care about, whether it's, I love looking at airplanes or something. Great, write about that. There's always going to be an angle. So, I think that we face that too, right? We don't want that lowest common denominator punditry. Anyone can get up on Fox News and just rail about something. I think what's really important to us is finding the people that care deeply about their subjects and their research and their expertise, and then just translating that. But we're not. I think, and Justin would say the same. We're not looking for talking heads that can talk about everything.
Yeah, that's true. And just, Aaron, going back to your question about this issue of teaching writing, a concern of mine actually relating to this is whether people read particularly well today. I know I myself worry sometimes that my ability to read closely in a way that really, where I'm really understanding why the language is effective, even as an editor every day, it's a constant struggle to maintain that because I'm bombarded with Twitter, with emails, with all kinds of forms of communication that are actually really crappy communication. They're effective on the level of grabbing my attention, but in terms of craft and in terms of expressive quality, they're really bad. And I wish I knew for sure how much of that was affecting everybody else and myself. I don't know. I'm sure there are actually studies that might show this, but I worry a lot about that. And I think that for people, an easy way to make sure that your writing is as good as possible is to read as much good writing as you can. Go back to the books that you read as an undergraduate and as a grad student that really spoke to you and that seemed to really be able to communicate something well. Go back to them, just read them. That's the best way to learn how to be a good writer, I think, is to read good writing.
My version of that is to go read fiction.
Yeah, absolutely, literature. Yeah, because that's where it's all about the language there, right? I mean, and so that's the purest form of that.
I think we have a question back here first.
I have a question for Henry, Ben, and Justin, and it goes to the discussion last panel on how engaged the Academy wants to be. Do you guys ever go out to academics and you want to know something about Ukraine? You have identified where the bodies are buried and where the gold is, and what you get back from them is a response, just no, I just don't care about what you're doing. Monkey cage is irrelevant to me. Or, if they don't say that explicitly, do they say it in terms of, no, I have so much work to do, and so I can't imagine spending some time on this. Do you guys ever get responses like that? And if so, how often do you get them?
I think it's rare for us that we get a full-on blow-off. What we will get is, oh, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to do that. Can I file something in 2 weeks? And by that time, at some level, this is a commodity enterprise, and we have to feed the sausage machine every day. So I will generally actually not say no to those kind of pitches. They just sort of fall by the wayside, and then we'll see if the person actually files something. And if it's good, then we'll use it, and we'll engage in a back and forth and an editing process. But I'd say that is most frequently the response. It's rare that people actually say no, or that they're too, sometimes it's they're too busy.
Ben, do you at least warn them that if they take 2 weeks, it's going to be harder for it to crack?
Yeah, I'll say, look, we are looking for something that is a little bit newsier, a little bit timelier. But again, if the piece is good and it is evergreen enough that it won't be overtaken by events in 2 weeks' time, then I'm happy to work with something like that. But it just falls below the level of, it just drops lower on the priority list.
I'd say the same thing. The key problem is that academics think about time in a very different way than journalists think about time. And this goes back to the publication cycle being one of a couple of years, where if you get your article in a week earlier or a week later, who cares about it? It's very, very hard to get academics to focus and to think in terms of the time that they need to think about. And also, usually people have a lot of responsibilities, and so whether they're able to drop everything to spend 6 hours writing that several hundred words, it's a crapshoot.
We had a question down front if we had, right?
Could I jump in on this last question?
Oh, yes, please.
So I think everything that everyone said strikes me as correct about the difference in timelines. I just think that there's a lot that an academic can do in a relevance way that is within the confines of the academic timeline. So, take the financial crisis in 2008. So that hits, and then there's obviously a lot of demand for analysis of what went wrong, why didn't our models tell us the right thing, and then there's scholars who sort of may or may not, by disposition or ability, be able to answer things on a 1 day, 2 day, 1 week timeline. But the questions are actually enormously complicated ones that nobody who's coming up with something spontaneous on the course of that timeline is actually in a position to actually give a very dispositive and useful answer, right? They can draw upon earlier critiques, but unless the hopper's full of not just sort of critiques of the status quo, but better models, ways that people can do better, there's a limit to how much impact you can really have. Whereas if you've been grinding for 10 years, 20 years in a way that is academic and perhaps quite technical and not something that is going to be published verbatim in any popular journal, you could nonetheless be extraordinarily relevant in forging a new way of understanding that at the point when people actually have demand for it is extraordinarily valuable and becomes relied upon. I mean, I think part of what we're living through now is the sort of cautionary tale of Jim Tobin's generation was successful in understanding something about how to avoid depressions, and partially relying heavily on that understanding, Ben Bernanke was able to avoid another one. But the kind of models of what the financial system looks like and should look like that were sort of relied upon heavily before the crisis were, I think, subject to scathing critique during the crisis, and now everybody's sort of using them again because all we had was critique. We didn't have a kind of a heterodox approach that ended up being simple enough or sort of compelling enough to actually enable people to be out in the real world making judgments, relying upon it. And so, to get ready for the crisis next time, there's a lot that scholars can be doing just wearing their scholar hats, being slow and careful and plodding in ways that are not lining up well with the media timescale, that are still relevant and in the long run will be very useful in getting through the media a broader readership and an understanding of important issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my question's for John. I'm happy to have others weigh in, but so John, I understand the goal of the Tobin project and I see the outputs. And I also, your story about early failures really resonated with me. Your brief description was something like, we put really smart academics and policymakers in the room and sort of just waited for the magic to happen, and it didn't. And so I'm really interested in the secret sauce. You haven't talked much about the process by which you actually succeed in bridging the gap, in getting scholars to focus their attention and their energies on real-world policy questions and or getting policymakers to engage. And I ask for rather self-serving reasons. A year and a half ago, we convinced the US government to give us a lot of money at Aid Data to set up a research consortium with around 100 scholars from around the world. And the proposal was, you will focus on the 7 big thematic strategic issues that USAID and the US government have identified. And we'll so put these people in different thematic groups and then pair them with policymakers within USAID. And so to make a long story short, the magic didn't happen or hasn't happened. And so we are really interested in process. How do you structure engagements and how do you structure relationships that you hope are maybe quite long, decades long. But, so what is the process by which it has worked for you all?
So let me bracket all this by saying that it remains an experiment, and we're always trying to do better and to get more efficient at it. But the core of the process, I think, is engaging people in sort of small enough groups in rigorous enough ways early on that you can actually get them to be honest with you about what they see as the lay of the land, which, when we've convened people in large conferences, that's been relatively harder to do because there's sort of audience effects. Putting in a lot of work, both amongst the scholars we work with and people on staff in doing research to see when people's sense of what's known and unknown is actually borne out by the literatures. And identifying a question before you start asking people for answers is something that's surprisingly hard to do. When you put in the time to get a question and then to get buy-in on that particular question from a number of interlocutors, you can get them to speak to each other in a much richer way than when you've got a topic and they're talking about the topic but maybe talking past each other, right? There's some kernel of shared vocabulary, but everybody's going in a different way with it. So having the question, both a problem in the world you want to be solving and an intellectual question that answering will go at least part of the way towards solving it, has struck us as very important. And how you get to that question, it's been an ad hoc process that we're trying to streamline. But it's more art than science, but it's about looking at the world and looking at the literatures and seeing where there's both a problem in the world that the currently evolved methodologies of the natural sciences, of the social sciences, could conceivably have some purchase on, either independently or brought together. And then seeing if you can get people excited about it, which is obviously a very necessary part of it.
These are arts that consulting firms have perfected. I mean, these are other groups of very smart people. If you look at McKinsey, I mean, they hire brilliant people, but they have built up a practice that they both talk to clients, they do focus groups, they ask the right questions. They're sort of, I think Josh is right. They're finding people and trying to ascertain questions. We also do a lot of work with McKinsey's global practice, and they just put out research. So they're doing both the push, saying, look how smart we are. We're taking a look at a 3-year look at India's economy, both on a macro level and a micro level. So they're also showing, to some extent, look, this is the kind of research we do. But then they're going to the small groups of people and asking the questions, and that's how, if there's anyone that I can think of, and this is certainly not my forte, the best consulting firms have perfected that art. And it doesn't sound entirely different.
Do we have another question back here?
Well, I had a comment on the writing issue. Is that still? Do you want to hear it?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
It's still with us. It's a problem that's still with us.
It's huge. It's so huge, and yet I do think that each of us in our own small way can do something about it. To me, my mind, there are two big problems out there, or several. But one is by the time we get them in our universities, they've already gone through K through 12,
Yeah.
right? By the time, then we send them out, and then they get to Ben and to Justin, right? And they're looking like, what the heck, why didn't you do something when you had them, before they got their PhDs and moved on. So I do have very strong views about having watched my kids grow up through the school system and being taught, you've talked about form writing. This is the way we teach kids how to write. There's sort of, this is the form, right? They're not given the opportunity to write things they're interested in. It's all very rote, and then they tune out. And so, if they had any opportunity, which I suppose at some, smaller private schools they would, to do creative writing, they might get interested in it. And then the problem is, in the disciplines that we're in, students seem quite surprised when you give them a hard time about their writing. And, I always tell my students, the one thing I just don't want to hear is, why are you bugging me about this? This isn't an English class, right? So I said, don't even, I've heard it, not interested. And, having had students in my class who are, I remember one woman, she wasn't doing very well. She came in to see me, said, why am I not doing better in this class? And I said, because your writing is so poor. And she said, nobody's ever told me that before. And I said, well, it's a good thing that somebody just told you, because, this is something you really need to work on. I think that that this is, for us, really being strict about this in our own classes and not allowing people to do well. Again, as a society that, as one of my colleagues says, is always about, that was a great swing, the ball's still sitting on the tee, but, that's the way we, tend to approach everything these days. And I think, we really aren't doing anybody any favors. And, it is such a huge societal problem, but we allow, and as I said, we have the problem that they've already gone through K through 12 by the time they come to college. But then we're responsible if we're letting them go through our schools or through a PhD program without telling them, this is not good enough, and these are the steps you need to take in order to try to do better. But as I said, it's also about, I think at the college level, because, you have these freshman writing classes and so on, that, if it's not on subjects they're interested in, they're not going to engage with the writing, and then, Ben and Justin get them and are unhappy.
With that, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. Do we have time for a last question? Down for? Well, why don't we go around the room, and we'll see if we can't just quickly.
Okay, hi, Mia again. So the question I had was mostly directed towards Justin and Ben. Partly the reason I reintroduced myself is I'm an outsider. I would write things. I actually write regular for a general audience from time to time. I do a lot of writing for CNN. And that's because I have a contact at CNN. And I wondered if part of what you're seeing is, on the pages of Foreign Affairs, I will very often see a lot of senior faculty, maybe Professor Fever, maybe some very well-known names, and you see them with some regularity. And it seems like it's really hard to break in.
Like it's a bad thing.
No, it's great for you. It's great for you. But it seems like it would be, the barriers to entry are very difficult. They're very high. And so it seems that on the one hand, we are chastising our young faculty for not being able to take their work and translate it to a regular audience and make what they do relevant, and so that the NSF doesn't piss all over us. And that, as well as the fact that we want to make sure that young faculty are professionalized from a very early period so that they don't have to wait until they're tenure or a full professor before they can start writing relevant materials. But at the same time, if they haven't had the pleasure to have lunch with you guys and know you guys, it seems it would be very difficult for Joe Schmo from X university that you may not know. So, it's like, I wonder how you navigate that tension, because I think that there is probably excellent work out there. But
No
if
question.
Sarah Krebs has to team up with Mika Zenko, because Mika's a known quantity to you, maybe Sarah less so, then, John Kay can't get through the door.
That's a good question. How important in this equation are big names and known quantities?
Sure. Do you want to do the other one? Or
Yeah.
is that, okay. I didn't.
I was going to ask whether you tend to favor explanatory versus prescriptive pieces, but what I really want to know is is there a place for moralizing, normative, ethical, from the heart based writing?
Was there a third question that we want to get on there? And
I have a question about impact. You all have measured impact by its likelihood to go viral. But there's another measure of impact, which is the likelihood that 6 months, 6 years, 60 years from now, we'd still be interested in reading it. And not everything in foreign affairs hits that, but some things do. And I still assign some things from 60 years ago in foreign affairs. Do you think anything of this new wave, the kind of stuff we see in Monkey Cage, kind of things we see on FP.com, will have that kind of 60-year impact?
I don't think it is a function of the medium as much as the sort of, I don't think it's a function of online versus print. We publish and are trying to publish and consistently publish long thought pieces online, 10,000-word pieces of narrative journalism that we hope will stand up, that we hope, will make an impact. There's George Kennan's X article, which everybody remembers from Foreign Affairs. Everyone in this room could probably name 10 pieces. We were very pleased to publish, Hillary Clinton's piece laying out the pivot to Asia, which was an important piece to do. It might not have been a scintillating read, but it was important and it's remembered. And that makes policy and that lasts. There's a balance here. That doesn't drive magazine sales, right? It brings a sort of intellectual rigor and a gravitas to the publication, which then maybe has effects. And it's something we try to balance. I think to your question, and everyone else should jump in, I have a sort of aversion to shoulds in pieces. They happen, we do them, policymakers like to write, the U.S., the West must do this when it comes to X, Y, or Z, Iran negotiations, this, that, the other thing. I think those are fine and they serve a purpose, but they tend to be somewhat disposable, unless there's a really sort of consistent big body of work. But there's a lot of that kind of stuff. Moral from the heart journalism, I think that's a high bar. It's a difficult thing to do well. We have parts of our website that do that, and I think there is certainly a place for it. We get a lot of that stuff from human rights, people involved in the human rights field. We recently launched, in conjunction with the USIP, a peace channel that sort of does, flips the notion of war on its head and sort of does conflict resolution, and that deals with human rights issues, and it's a little bit moral into how we should fix the world. But it's a difficult thing to do well. And then, I guess finally, big names are important, and big ideas are important. And, I always face, there's a small, Justin and I sort of joke about this, that we sort of know everyone, and we became friends through, different socials, by chance. But, in the world of the people who do the kind of work we do, it's a relatively small network. And it is sometimes not easy to pull yourself out of that network and to reach far afield to names you haven't heard of, because it's just a question of time and juggling. It's not a question of interest. I said before that we really expanded our roster of contributors, and we reached all over the world to a group of people to try and freshen up and bring some new voices into the mix. That took months. That was months of effort. And it seems like, how hard can it be to find 10 new people to write on global health? To find people that can consistently do that and produce copy well and have written books and bring a certain imprimatur. I mean, we were tearing out our hair with lists of names and we want to do this. It wasn't easy. That said, I think it's enormously valuable to do so. I think it makes foreign policy a richer and more vibrant publication, and we try to do it. Anyway.
I think we're cutting into coffee break, so if we can combine this into one question, can I ask you to sort of weigh moral imperative, star power, long-term impact.
I got lucky.
Okay,
I
I'm
get
gonna
to
go.
break it up.
I'm gonna, ready? 10 seconds, ready? Nothing gives us more pleasure than publishing a new voice, period. Nothing. And we work very hard to do it. I mean, we tear our hair out too trying to find people. Of course, there's an advantage if you're already within a sort of social network. It's the same as any business, but nothing gives us more pleasure than doing that. It's also especially a factor with foreign policy stuff that the gender ratio is so skewed. And that's the other part of it that we're constantly trying to, work for, because it's just, there's a path determinacy with all these men in these positions, and they're publishing more men, and so that is, your example of Micah and Sarah, to me, was also instructive from that element too. So the other thing, we're constantly pushing for that. Moralizing. I'd be interested in what Peter Singer has to say about the ethics of animal rights, or another Martha Nussbaum. So I'd be interested in an authoritative take on the morals or ethics of some topic, but I'm not particularly interested in what's somebody who just thinks is sort of wrong or right. No. Impact. Yes, Peter. We that's definitely part of our metric. Is this something that would be read years and years from now? For the web, less so. For the stuff that's newsier or on cycle, that's not as big of a thing. It's more like, in a month or two, is it going to be relevant? But for the print pieces, and we do have a little bit of a distinction here, the print pieces, we're looking for that piece that is going to be on syllabi for years, if not decades. Absolutely, that's the goal. How often do we reach it? We're not batting 250, let's put it that way.
And in terms of blogs, is it the same sort of metrics, or?
Same and different. Very quickly, I think moral, for us in the Monkey Cage, we tend not to look for pieces which have moral, which have strong political viewpoints to one way or the other. We do have some implicit pieces which have implicit arguments. We sometimes make arguments as to whether or not this policy is a bad idea. That's about as far as it goes. In terms of who we reach out to, again, we use networks. We draw on a different set of networks, which are maybe wider in some ways, but I suspect that as we go on, we're going to get more and more pushback, because, again, it's a question of time. You're looking for somebody to write on topic X. You don't have time to search through a whole bunch of different people's websites, so you go to somebody who you think is sort of competent, and that creates some potential problems down the line. We are more open to blind submissions, I think, because we do not get 100 submissions a day, so that makes life easier. And in terms of impact, I think Peter's point is a good one. I doubt that any Monkey Cage posts are going to be read with great sort of degree of reverence 100 years from now. But I think that there's a useful indirect thing that's happening, which is that by pulling academics more and more into contact with broader public forms of communication, it makes it more likely that indirectly academics are going to write work which is going to live for a broader community than the community that they have been writing for hitherto. And so I think the Monkey Cage and other blogs like it are small cogs in that process of dragging these two spheres together in ways that hopefully are going to be useful for both.
And finally, John, I think you made an eloquent case for the Tobin's Project view on long-term impact and research. Do you have any final thoughts on these questions that have been asked in terms of?
I think that when somebody's wearing their hat as a social scientist on the normative question of should one be moralizing, I think it's very important to be moral in choosing the questions that you want to investigate, to have your values drive what questions you think are important. And then I think you need to let good science guide your answers to those questions. And so hopefully you're picking important topics to interrogate, and then you're learning things that help people to understand what would be the right things to do, right? Not just saying because it's right, but giving them reasons why certain ways of approaching the world are going to lead to certain outcomes, and different ways we could expect would lead to different ones.
Well, thank you so much to each of you. I appreciate your time and your energies here in helping to answer our questions in terms of outreach. I don't know if we've solved the issue. I think we found we're a culture of terrible writers, and we're impatient in terms of research, but it's a start. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.